Well, a lot of people love Strauss more than just neocons, but I mean,
Well,
let me get into that. So,
yeah.
What is a neocon? A neocon is a liberal who is has a kind of intellectual take which leads him or her to embrace conservative positions for the sake of So their tendency is going to be liberal. And what is a liberal? A liberal is somebody.
Can you clarify liberal? Do you mean classical liberal, like Enlightenment liberal, or Hillary Clinton liberal? Which she's
Well, I mean, I think
herself.
there's a connection between those. I mean, but I think we can go too far in the direction of saying like classical liberalism is the opposite of modern liberalism. Like, no, there's an implicit connection in
there's a lineage there.
Yeah, well, and in the embrace of individualism.
Correct.
Right. That's if there's one thing which defines liberalism, it's that government is for the sake of protecting individual rights.
Right.
And so the individual has a kind of has a veto sort of over the group or the tradition or the institution.
Right.
So the neocons are all liberals in that sense, but then this question of, okay, so what policy do you embrace following upon that? Right. And that's where you're going to have disagreement, and where liberals could embrace, what they think a Straussian conclusion would be with regard to like foreign policy.
Right. Well, that's generally what I would say.
Right. That's how they're associated with, and the Iraq War, which think about what that is. It's thinking that individualism and the forces of liberalism can supplant what you perceive to be disastrous or harmful traditions or institutions in other places in the world.
Right.
But this is,
I would argue that neocons have an almost evangelical nature to their kind of love of liberalism, to me, it seems like they export the Declaration of Independence everywhere they go. Right.
But I mean, maybe.
Because I mean,
I don't know. I feel like for them it's more calculated. I think it's more like the U.S. needs to wield power in the world, and so how is it going to do this? Is it going to do this through kind of realpolitik, where you say, let me just think about interests and just put aside ideology? In that way, 20th century foreign policy is starting with like people like George Kennan, and they're a reaction to the kind of ideological liberalism of somebody like, say, Wilson. But then the neocons are a kind of further step where they implicitly, the way they really think, they really have realist premises, like so-called realist. I would say so-called realist, because real realism would be realizing that people care about what they believe and will do things that are somewhat irrational because of them. But so taking those realist premises, which say people just are motivated by, interest and balance of power, and you need to put aside ideology, they go another step where they say, well, yeah, but people do care about ideology in service of their interests. So if you can find an ideology that will be useful for promoting the interests that we want, like that's what we should do. And so, I mean, that's a very simplistic, rough way of putting it. But like the neocons, like people like, I mean, we're thinking about people like Bill Kristol, Irving Kristol is the original
father. Yeah,
who they're not, like we see now from Bill Kristol, like there's not in any way a conservative, but he just favors policy which other parts of the liberal establishment would disagree with, but because he's more cynical, right? Like that's the real difference here. It's just a kind of cynicism versus like idealism. But then so Bill Kristol has like some tangential relationship to Straussianism. Like he was a student to some degree of Harvey Mansfield, who's like the chief Straussian who at Harvard, who is somewhat of an independent development. He's not really a direct student of Strauss so much as a scholar of Strauss.
Okay.
But then you have people like who are students of Alan Bloom. So Alan Bloom was like the most famous of Strauss's students at Chicago.
Okay.
He's famous for writing The Closing of the American Mind, which is a sort of popular, just a very popular book. And he was a very gregarious person and cultivated all these connections. And he taught at Cornell and other places. And in those places, like he had a lot of students who were not going to go on to be, great scholars. I mean, they were very intelligent, but they went on and they went into government.
Sure. Policy and all that stuff.
Yeah. And some of them, like, for instance, like Paul Wolfowitz is the one everyone always mentions. And I think I don't remember who made this line, but it's like people hate Paul Wolfowitz because his name starts menacingly and ends Jewishly. I remember who said that, but it seems right to me. But he was a student of Bloom at Cornell, I think. And then he went on to like the Office of like Special Plans or something, where like basically that's where they cooked up all of this, kind of, like that's where you get the kind of like Straussian neocon connection where, Iraq war mongering. I mean, this is really like circa 15 years ago, but,
right, early 2000s, that kind of stuff.
But I would say that's a very limited like offshoot of like what Strauss is about.
So you're saying,
and then just in terms of like the political connections, like in terms of like present political movements, like the other side of the coin is what is called West Coast Straussian, which is the students of Harry Jaffa in California.
I was going to say Jaffa's the big one. Is that Claremont he's out of or was out of?
Yeah, in Claremont. Yeah. Which is connected to obviously there's the Claremont Institute
and then my boy Larry Arnn, I believe, was a student of Jaffa. So you got the Hillsdale.
Yeah, and he's a Claremont fellow or whatever they call it. Yeah.
Interesting. So it seems like my premise that the neocons love Strauss is purely pragmatic, and that they've found a thinker who potentially has some thoughts they agree with, and they've used him to justify their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's no necessary political conclusions from the teaching of Strauss. I mean,
interesting. So who are some of the other people?
He's beyond liberalism. He's beyond conservatism. Like,
see, I like that. I want to get beyond.
He's liberalism. Like, it's not. I mean, so you have these derivations where you have the question of like, okay, what is the American regime and what should it be now? Like, these are prudential questions. Like philosophy. Sure. Like Strauss is all about the recovery of ancient philosophy and of the perennial political questions. He's not about these political conclusions will follow. That's a matter of prudence, right? How you are able to take particular circumstances and align them with principles. The thing, though, about Straussianism and how it relates to politics is that the sly thing, the thing that is suspicious, right? When people, hear about it, is that the question of principle itself becomes contingent on regime, right? So the Straussian thinks, here's like the cartoonish way to put it.
Sure. Give me the cartoon.
Isn't necessarily the wrong way to put it at all, but the Straussian thinks like each regime is contingent. Like it's a kind of enveloping atmosphere of opinion that is not simply truth. And so it's going to have assumptions and beliefs, which the enlightened philosopher can see beyond. So I recognize that there are sort of like useful lies that everyone believes. And I will use these cynically or not as I see fit. So the question is like, what is the character of the American regime? And what are its sort of enveloping atmosphere and opinions like? Is it a simply modern regime that has a kind of low but stable basis in natural rights-based social contract theory of Hobbes and Locke?
Sure.
Or is it and thus like has a kind of implicit egalitarianism and doesn't promote high noble things, and so is somewhat leads to a sort of petty and small souls and consumerism and all of that? Or does it like retain some elements of like the ancient or the classical understanding of virtue and of statesmanship, and of the responsibility of the noble, of the people, of to pursue the noble. So the difference between the East and the West is more is on the disagreement on that question. The West Coast believes that there's more of a continuity with the entire tradition, and that there are elements of sort of classical statesmanship and classical virtue and republicanism preserved in the American regime, whereas the East Coasters more consider, the American sort of not, it's more of a sort of haphazard consequence of happy circumstances and modern political, modern philosophy. And so it's not very enlightened and doesn't have much continuity with the ancient, which is higher and no more noble.
Right.
But the funny thing is, like, the neoconservatives who went abroad searching for monsters, and they're more of the East Coast school. Right. So their use of like liberalism and individualism as a kind of, weapon is entirely cynical.
Right. Well, I would argue that's kind of this is a bit off topic, but I would say that's one of the like defining things about liberalism in the broad sense, is that it tends to like pick up ideologies that it finds useful for it to aggregate power. And in the neocon side, you see it kind of doing that with tradition, with conservative values, right? All the taglines we've grown to hate. And then on the kind of left side of it, liberal side of things, you see them do that with like critical race theory and all this other kind of stuff, right? It's very much to be cynical about the cynics, it's very much a power grab, right? Like, it seems like that's what the defining characteristic of that kind of liberal side of things.
Yeah, although let me qualify that a bit in terms of just the neoconservatives. It's not just a cynical using of ideology. Like, they really believe that the way of life afforded by liberalism will smooth over the rough places. And that, I mean, it's a kind of Montesquieuian notion of the softness of commerce. Like, commerce destroys hard mores and makes us soft, which is what you want. So in China, for instance,
well, let's say that seems like the big example that we exported capitalism to China or whatever,
and it's supposed to make them
that didn't happen. Really,
it did not happen, not at all. No. They're just like, oh yeah, sure, like we'll use all of this research and technology and consumerism, and like we'll create an army of
we will absolutely hurt ourselves in the process, and then control our population even more thoroughly.
So but that was that's the same thing as in Iraq and the Middle East is the notion that if you introduce Western style capitalism and commercialism there, it will solve the problems of peace. Whereas the more like sort of hardcore realpolitik would be somebody more like Trump, who was just like, we'll support a strongman dictator. Like, that's better than stability there is good for us. So whatever will lead to stability. And but the problem with that is you have to believe that these peoples are all ready for and clamoring for this, and not that just centuries of traditions and tribalism are just going to persist. And so it's really a failure to they're not thinking they think that they're really cynical, but they're not thinking cynically enough, which is just that there are just differences between peoples that go back very far.
That's why I say it feels almost evangelical. It's like, here, have the free market, it'll save you, right? It'll save you from your terrible oppressive traditions that hate women and all the other liberal values we currently have.